Good afternoon. On behalf of the Department of Microbiology, TN Medical College and Nair Hospital, I welcome to the third series from dissertation to publication, protocol writing. I thank the faculty Dr. Priya Ranganathan and the delegates who have taken their valuable time out to participate today. I will now invite Program Director Dr. Jayanti Shastri, Professor and Head Department of Microbiology, TN Medical College and Nair Hospital, Mumbai, to give the introductory remark. Over to you, Dr. Jayanti Shastri.
Good evening and welcome to our webinar series, Dissertation to Publication. So we have had the first two, that is the literature search, which we had 2 weeks ago. Last week, we had biostatistics in research. And the next very important topic is protocol writing. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Priya Ranganathan with us to cover this topic. So Dr. Priya is a consultant anesthesiologist at Tata Memorial Hospital. She has a very special interest in thoracic anesthesia and is a member of the Specialized Thoracic Anesthesia Working Group. She completed her undergraduate and postgraduate training at the King Edward Memorial Hospital, Mumbai. She is the member of the Institutional Review Board at Tata Memorial Hospital and coordinates a postgraduate degree course in clinical research at TMC. She has organized several courses on biostatistics and clinical research methodology and is the editor of biostatistics sections for the journals Perspectives in Clinical Research and Indian Journal of Critical Care Medicine. She is the convener of the International Collaboration for Research Methods Development in Oncology workshop, which is an intensive residential oncology research protocol development workshop, which is conducted at Tata Memorial Hospital. In fact, after reading all this, I'm even adding that we are extremely fortunate. So, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be talking about protocol writing, which is such an important area in any dissertation. And depending upon the strength of your protocol, your publication, your manuscript also is written accordingly. And your publications surely depends upon the content of the manuscript. So without further ado, over to you, Dr. Priya.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and it's a privilege to be here today.
I have to stop sharing 1 minute.
I have stopped.
Yeah.
Right. The topic given to me today is protocol writing, and over the next 40 minutes or so, we will look at different aspects of a protocol. This is going to be the outline of my talk. What is a research protocol? Why do you need a research protocol? And what are the various elements of a research protocol, which include the actual protocol document, the patient information sheet and the informed consent document, and very briefly, a look at the case record form. I will be taking questions at the end. So if you have any questions, please jot them down and we can discuss them at the end of the talk. So what is a research protocol? It is defined as a documentary statement of procedures to be used to conduct research. Basically, what it does is it describes what the researchers are intending to do and how they will do it. It's a very, very important document in clinical research, and you could actually call it the guidebook to clinical research. So why do we need this research protocol? First, the protocol is written before you start the research study. So it forces the investigator to think about all aspects of the study. Very often we have an idea, but we're not very clear about the intricate details about how we're going to go ahead with that idea and convert it into a research study. And this is where writing a research protocol makes us or forces us to jot down every single aspect of that research study so that there is complete clarity by the time you start the research project. The second thing is it standardizes the methodology. So when you have a written protocol, everybody who is part of that research study follows the exact same protocol. This is particularly important when you have multi-centric projects where standard practices may vary slightly. While that is okay for clinical practice, it is not okay in a research project. And having a written protocol is the way to ensure uniformity across different sites. The third, it is necessary for ethics committee approval. So when you apply to the institutional ethics committee, they ask for a written protocol because that is what they will go through to decide the scientific and ethical aspects of the study and whether they are okay to be approved. Fourth, it is necessary for the application for funding. So when you're applying to any external agency for funding, a copy of your research protocol is needed so that they can weigh the merits of the study and decide whether to fund the study or not. And lastly, as Dr. Shastri has already pointed out, a well-written protocol goes a long way in helping you to draft your manuscript because the protocol contains many elements which are common to the protocol and to the final manuscript paper. And if you've put in enough effort while writing the protocol, it makes your manuscript that much easier to write. Now, there are two types of studies that we do. What most of us will do are investigator-initiated studies, where we generate an idea and we conceive the project and we go ahead with it. Examples of these would be thesis or other departmental academic studies. As opposed to this, we have sponsored or industry-driven studies. Here, the pharmaceutical industry approaches you to do a study at your site. Now, the difference between these two is that in industry-driven projects, the protocol is usually written by the sponsor, the pharmaceutical industry. And therefore, the protocol is ready and you have very little to contribute to the protocol. On the other hand, the investigator-initiated study is completely your baby, and you have to write the entire protocol. And the rest of this session is going to be devoted to writing protocols for investigator-initiated studies. So these are the elements of a protocol. We have a protocol document, we have an informed consent document, and a case record form. The protocol document, as I already said, is the main guidebook for the entire study. It tells you everything about the study, the who, what, when, where, why, and how of the study. It consists of a title, which tells you what is the study, the names of the investigators and their departmental affiliations, which tells you who is doing the study and where, the introduction, which says why are you doing the study, and the methods, which tell you how are you doing the study and when and what are you assessing. So let's go over these different components in some detail. As I already said, it's a title, investigators and affiliations, introduction, and methods. So the title tells us what is the study. The investigators and affiliations tell us who is doing the study and where. The introduction tells us why are you doing the study, and the methods tell us how are you doing the study and what and when are you going to assess. Now, for a title, it's always difficult to reach a balance between brevity and giving too much information, right? If you have a short, catchy title, it is easy to remember. If you have a long title, it gives more information, but it's difficult to read and remember. This is an example of a very informative title, a double-masked randomized crossover study comparing the effect of latanoprost with timolol on intraocular pressure and ocular blood flow in patients with primary open-angle glaucoma or ocular hypertension. A nice long title. I don't know if somebody has already covered the PICOT format with you all. Basically, in research, when we come up with a research idea, we talk about something called PICOT, which means the population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcome. And T is the time point. So whenever you're expressing your research idea as a question, you need to cover all these aspects. And that is exactly what this title has done. It has told you what is the population. Patients with primary open angle glaucoma or ocular hypertension. The intervention is latanoprost. The comparator is timolol. Okay. The outcome is intraocular pressure and ocular blood flow. It has also told you what kind of study design is being used, a double mask randomized crossover study. So while this title is extremely complete and informative, it is a difficult title to remember or recall. As opposed to this, titles like these, the INGOT study, India Glaucoma Outcomes and Treatment, or the ETROP study, glaucoma in the early treatment for retinopathy of prematurity. So when you have abbreviations or acronyms like this, it is much easier to remember and refer to it, but it doesn't tell you much about the study design or the research question. There is no definite answer to this. Should your title be brief? Should your title be informative? I think the best thing to do is reach a balance between the two. The next part of the protocol is the investigators, and it is important to list them in the order in which they contributed to the study or will be contributing to the study. So the person who conceived the idea obviously is listed first as the principal investigator, and then other investigators are listed. Usually, the last investigator or the senior most investigator is the mentor or the overall supervisor of the study. It is important to list investigators and their institutes in the study because it gives credibility to the study. It gives a sense of ownership and delegates responsibility. And also, when you're writing the manuscript, we usually follow more or less the same order to decide authorship. Next, we come to the introduction to the protocol. So here the question is, what is the problem? What do we already know? What is the gap in knowledge? And what will this study add to that gap? Which means, why are we doing the study? Let's look at this hypothetical example of latanoprost versus timolol for the treatment of primary glaucoma. Okay. So what is the problem? You need to have a brief line or two about the treatments available for glaucoma and the problems with those treatments. Are they expensive? Do they have side effects? Do they need very frequent dosing? Whatever. What do we already know? So is there any preliminary data regarding these two drugs that you're planning to compare? Quote only the relevant studies. What is the gap in knowledge? So there are no large clinical studies comparing these two on a head-to-head basis. What will this study add? So the aim of this study is to determine whether latanoprost is superior to timolol. And the hypothesis is that latanoprost will be superior to timolol. Remember, keep the introduction brief, not more than 5 or 6 sentences. It is just a build up to the rest of the protocol. Don't make it huge and multiple pages so that the reader loses interest in the rest of the protocol. Second, keep it relevant. So if you're doing a study on latanoprost and timolol, you don't need to start with the history of latanoprost, when it was discovered, what was the first use. All that is irrelevant, right? Start with what is directly relevant. We know that latanoprost is being used for glaucoma. So start by saying latanoprost is used in glaucoma and offers the following advantages. And make it interesting and like a story. The introduction ends with an aim and a hypothesis. So the aim is the overall question that the study is trying to answer. What are you trying to find? To determine whether latanoprost is superior to timolol. The hypothesis is, what do you think you will find? So obviously when we start a study, we have a certain belief, right? That's why we're doing the study. So we have a belief that A will be better than B, or A will be equal to B, or two ways of measuring something will be in agreement, whatever. So for this particular study, the hypothesis is that latanoprost will be superior to timolol. Now, when I'm comparing latanoprost and timolol, I could look at various things, right? What is the decrease in intraocular pressure? Which one acts for a longer duration? Which is cheaper? Which has less side effects? Which is easier to administer? So when I broadly use the word superior, what exactly do I mean? Right? I need to start zeroing in. And that is where the objectives of a study come in. So while the aim is a very broad question, objectives are more specific questions. The primary objective is the most important question that a study hopes to answer, and it forms the basis for the sample size calculation. In addition, we could have some secondary objectives, which would involve questions like adverse effects, cost, quality of life, or any subgroup analysis. So for this particular study, the primary objective was to measure the change in intraocular pressure from baseline to month 6. The secondary objectives were to estimate the proportion of patients in each group who had more than 50% reduction in IOP and the proportion of patients who needed rescue medication. All of this is hypothetical. I've made it up just to give you examples of what we mean by a primary main objective and secondary objectives. Usually studies will have a single primary objective, and that is what decides the sample size. You could have some studies which have co-primary objectives. Studies may have 2 or 3 secondary objectives. Remember, the study is not powered for secondary objectives, and they are usually hypothesis generating. Next, we move on to the methods section. So in the methods, we cover the study design, the eligibility criteria, details of patient selection, details of interventions, outcomes and outcome assessment, the statistical plan, and any safety issues. Let's go over each of these. I don't know whether you've already had a class on study designs. So I'll just briefly go over this. Study designs can broadly be classified as experimental studies and observational studies. Observational studies are where the exposure occurs naturally, right? So people are naturally smokers or non-smokers. Some people drink alcohol, some people don't. Some people eat healthy, some people don't, right? Some people receive a particular drug. For example, for the treatment of a sore throat, some people got amoxicillin, others got maybe levofloxacin, right? So here, the exposure has already happened. You have not decided who would get amoxicillin and who would get levofloxacin. These are what we call observational studies, where the exposure to a particular so-called intervention has happened naturally, and you are only observing the outcomes. Within these, we could have descriptive studies and analytical studies. In descriptive studies, we talk about case reports and case series. In analytical studies, you could have cross-sectional surveys, cohort studies, and case control studies. I don't have the time to go into details of each of these, but broadly, this is the classification. On the other hand, the other broad category is interventional studies or experimental studies where you assign the exposure. So you take a group of people and randomize them so that half of them receive levofloxacin and half of them receive the other antibiotic, right? Or you randomize them so that some of them undergo a surgery, whereas others are managed with medical treatment. Remember, experimental studies are not possible for all research questions. If I want to look at the association between smoking and lung cancer, I cannot randomize people to smoke and not smoke because that is not ethical. It is harmful. For such questions, I have to do observational studies. So remember, randomized trials, though they are the ideal study design, are possible only when the question lends itself to randomization. For interventions which are likely to be harmful, we cannot randomize participants and we have to use observational data. The next part of the protocol deals with eligibility. Who are you going to include in the study and who are you going to exclude, right? Now remember, the two are not the converse of each other. Let's look at an example. So in this study, the inclusion criteria was age more than 18 years and glaucoma diagnosed more than 3 months ago. Now, when I say I'm including people who are more than 18 years, it automatically means that I'm excluding people who are less than 18. And I don't need to spell that out in the exclusion criteria. Similarly, when I say I'm including somebody who had glaucoma diagnosed more than 3 months ago, it automatically means I'm excluding somebody who had glaucoma diagnosed less than 3 months ago, right? On the other hand, the exclusion criteria need to be specific. Out of the people I'm including, who am I not going to continue? Who am I going to take out? So patients with allergy to any of the study medications, pregnant patients, those who are lactating, refusal of consent, and previous surgery for the same condition. These are specific exclusion criteria, which, just to re-emphasize, are not the converse of the inclusion criteria. Sometimes we tend to make our inclusion criteria very restrictive. So I say I will include only those in the age group of 18 to 45 years, females, non-hypertensive, non-diabetic, not on any other medications with normal liver and renal function. How many such patients do you think you're going to see? Not many, right? So the problems of having very restrictive inclusion criteria are you cannot generalize the results beyond the study criteria. It does not mimic clinical practice. It makes your study quite complex and it decreases patient pool because you're unlikely to find so many patients meeting the eligibility criteria. Avoid vague criteria. I will exclude patients who are unreliable for follow-up. What does that mean? Who decides what is unreliable? I will exclude patients who are unable to comprehend the study or patients who have intraoperative complications. Specific. What exactly is an intraoperative complication? Right? What exactly is unable to comprehend? If you keep vague criteria, it is prone to bias because one center or one investigator may interpret this in one way and another investigator may interpret it differently, leading to a lot of problems. We move on to consent after eligibility. So we need to specify in the protocol who will screen participants. Is it the researcher or the nurse? Who is going to perform any screening tests if they're needed? And what are those screening tests? And consent. Who is going to consent the participants? How and when will the consent be taken? So you need to have a separate paragraph on consenting. We move on next to the actual nuts and bolts of the study. Now I'm doing a randomized study, so I will need to talk about who will randomize. Is it a researcher? Is it an independent person? Is it a statistician? How will randomization be carried out? There are various ways of randomizing participants. You could use computer-generated numbers. You could use a random number table. Are we using any criteria at the time of randomization? So are we going to stratify as per age or weight or any other criteria? And a very important component of all randomized trials is something called allocation concealment. How do you prevent people from knowing what the next allocation in the randomization is? Are you going to use opaque envelopes, or are you going to use any central systems like a computer method or a telephonic method? If you're doing an observational study, these exact parameters will not apply, but there you will still need to talk about how are you going to select participants and how are you going to include the participants and decide whom to exclude. For both observational and randomized studies, we need to talk about details of interventions, and the details must be so specific that anyone reading the protocol is able to follow the same protocol. So what happens in the intervention group? For example, I will give 1 drop of latanoprost every morning at 8 a.m. Right? If you're going to give drugs on a per kilogram basis, that needs to come in. If you're going to make adjustments for age or renal function or liver function, that needs to come in. Right? Similarly, in the control group, what are you going to do? What other management is going to be allowed? In this study, am I going to allow patients to take steroids or carbonic anhydrase inhibitors or other treatments that they are receiving? We talk about blinding or masking, which means are participants, researchers, and assessors going to be aware of what drug who is getting? And if they're not going to be aware, then how are you going to blind them? Are you going to use similar looking bottles? Are you going to cover the bottles with brown paper? So you need to work out those logistics and mention them in the protocol. What we want to do in this study is measure certain outcomes, right? So the outcome is the consequence of interest. In this study, my primary outcome is change in intraocular pressure from baseline to month 6. The outcome measure is how exactly is this outcome going to be measured? I'm going to measure it in millimeters of mercury using a particular tonometer at so-and-so time point. And I need to specify who is going to do these measurements. Is it an ophthalmologist? Is it a nurse, right? Remember, for every objective that you mentioned in your method section, you need to have a matching outcome and an outcome measure. So every primary and secondary objective will have a primary outcome and outcome measure and a secondary outcome and outcome measure. For example, in this study, some of the outcomes were intraocular pressure and visual acuity. I need to give details about how each of these will be measured and by whom and when. If there are subjective outcomes, for example, headache, blurring, nausea, you need to try and capture these outcomes using standardized scales so that there is no bias. Who is going to assess? Are those people going to be masked or blinded? Using what technique and at what time points? It's helpful to provide a flow chart of visits and assessments so that at a glance, people know what the study is all about and when each visit or assessment is likely to be done. Nitya has spoken to you about statistics in the last lecture. So the statistical plan is a very important part of the protocol. What tests are you going to use to analyze your data? And what will you consider a significant result? If you're making multiple comparisons between groups, are you going to be adjusting for those multiple comparisons? Are there any pre-specified subgroups that you're looking at? If so, you need to mention them. Also, if you're planning to have a look at your data in the middle of your study, then you need to specify exactly at what time point you're analyzing. I don't know whether Nitya covered sample size. That is again a part of the protocol that will be looked at very carefully, and it determines the overall validity of the study results. What is the expected treatment effect? So how much difference are you expecting between the two groups? We have something called the type 1 and the type 2 statistical errors, which decide how reliable your results are, and those need to be mentioned. I'm sorry, I don't have the time to get into that right now. Based on this, what is the sample size that you're looking at? And how feasible is this study? So if you need 113 patients per group, how many such patients do you see per month or per week? So how long do you think it is going to take you to accrue your pay? How are you going to report adverse events and look at safety data? This is far more important in an interventional study as compared to an observational study, because in an interventional study, we are administering the interventions, and therefore most side effects or many side effects are likely to be related to participation in the study. Okay, so what are the outcomes you're looking at to prove safety of your intervention? Are you looking at heart rate, blood pressure? Are you looking at ophthalmoscopy? How are you going to report adverse events? There are many criteria which are available, standardized for reporting of adverse events, and you could use one of those. For example, in oncology, we use something called the CTC, Common Terminology of Classification of Adverse Events, which is a very standard criteria for reporting adverse events. And at what point are you going to withdraw somebody from the study? So if somebody's intraocular pressure keeps increasing beyond a particular limit, are you going to continue him or her on the study, or are you going to say, no, we need to switch to something else? If somebody is showing poor compliance, refusal to follow up, are you going to continue that person, right? So all this needs to be mentioned. The last part of the protocol is the bibliography, which is a list of references in the order in which they appear in the protocol. And these will be related mainly to the introduction. So if I had to summarize, this is the alphabet soup of a protocol. A for aim, B for background, C for criteria of selection and withdrawal, D for the study design, D also for the drugs or interventions, E for ethics, which includes consent and other approvals, E for examinations, which would include clinical, lab, and other examinations, and E for endpoints or outcomes, which would include efficacy outcomes, safety outcomes, and other numbers. F for figures, that is your statistics, and F for flowchart of activities. We move on quickly to the informed consent document. So you know that for any research study, you need to either take informed consent from participants, okay, or obtain permission from the institutional ethics committee for a waiver of consent. So if it is a retrospective study with minimal risk to participants, then some institutional ethics committees will consider waiving the requirement for informed consent. General instructions for, can everybody please mute? There's a lot of disturbance. The general instructions for informed consent documents are, you will need informed consent forms in English and local languages, which would include probably Marathi, Hindi in our state. And if you have a lot of Bengali speaking or Tamil speaking or Telugu speaking, you may want to consider having informed consent forms in those languages. All consent forms must have a version number, date, and a page number. Separate forms should be prepared when minors, that is children, are the study participants. For mature minors, usually more than 8 years, we have something called an assent form. But remember, for anybody below 18, the parent or the legal guardian signs the consent form, and the child only gives either verbal or written assent. Remember to use simple, non-technical language in the consent form. What should your informed consent document include? you start with a statement that this is research. This is not part of your standard treatment. This is a research study. What is the purpose of this research and what are the methods of the study? What are the risks and benefits in this study? What are the alternatives available if you choose not to participate in this study? A provision that the data acquired in the study will be kept confidential and anonymity of the participant will be assured. If there is likely to be any injury related to participation, then what is the compensation policy? Who can they contact if they have further questions or need more information? And finally, a statement that their participation is completely voluntary and that they will not be penalized if they choose not to participate in this study. We also attach a case record form along with every protocol, and this is the form on which we are going to record the parameters that we discovered during the study. So obviously you will have to tailor the case record form depending on the nature of your study. But in general, some principles are: please avoid patient identifiers. We have told the patient that his data will be anonymous. And so the case record form should not contain any patient identifiers such as name or file number or hospital ID or anything like that. You could use initials or give the patient a separate study ID and then have a separate log of what each study ID represents. The second important thing is keep your CRF brief, right? Capture only those details which are absolutely essential. For example, you like to capture the education status, marital status, father's name, grandfather's name, address. Think about, are you really going to use that data in your analysis? If not, please don't capture it. When you have very long CRFs, you end up having more missing data and people just enter all kinds of wrong information just to complete the CRF. So keep it as simple and as brief as possible so that you're maximizing your chances of getting complete and credible data. Keep it objective. So wherever possible, use yes, no, mild, moderate, severe. Okay. Avoid free text questions as much as possible because coding it later and making sense out of it is difficult. And lastly, every CRF which is submitted along with the protocol should have a version number and a date. Okay, and that is to help the ethics committee and the researcher to keep track of which protocol version, which consent form, and which CRF is currently being used. I think this is my last slide. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
That was really very, very interesting and very methodical, I should say. So now the floor is totally open. Whoever has any questions, either you can put it in your chat box or you can ask.
Madam, I have a question, please.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Priya, Dr. Priya, for this beautiful talk, so lucid. I think we all understood, including our PGs. Thanks a ton. My question is, we are in the microbiology lab, so where we work with, we are talking of various microbiological studies, what are the organisms, but at the same time, we do need to know a little about the background of the patient, whether he has diabetes or whether he has, he has taken steroids or some such similar, any kind of patient-related data, besides age and sex. And so in these cases, should we ask for a waiver of consent, or do we have to have a consent?
It would depend completely on your ethics committee. If you look at the Indian Council of Medical Research guidelines for research, any study which involves no more than minimal risk, and your study would fall into that, right? By acquiring this data, you're not putting the patient at any risk. And therefore, this falls into the criteria of less than minimal risk. This actually qualifies for a waiver of consent. However, the onus is on the ethics committee. So some ethics committee would say that because you're using patient data, the patient has the right to know about it and to consent whether or not his data should be used. So there is no answer to this. You could try asking for a waiver of consent, and as per ICMR guidelines, you do fit into the criteria for waiver of consent. However, the final decision would have to be taken by your ethics committee.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yeah. Elaborate on types of endpoints and how do we write them in our academic protocol?
Types of endpoints, are you talking about primary and secondary endpoints? Are you talking about survival endpoints, or if I could get some background, which department you're from?
Chaya is the head of physiotherapy.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes, I wanted to know the endpoints in terms of the soft endpoints and the hard endpoints, and how do we write them in our academic protocol writing?
Soft and hard endpoints, better known as subjective and objective endpoints. Objective endpoints are endpoints which are very clear, where there is no doubt whoever assesses. For example, mortality, right? A patient is either dead or not dead. There is no ambiguity about that. Whether you assess it or I assess it or a third person assesses it, we are all going to conclude the same thing. On the other hand, if I was to ask you, pain, severity of pain, right? If you look at a patient sitting in his bed, you may say he has mild pain, whereas I may say he has moderate pain. Okay. If you were to look at a patient reported nausea and vomiting, okay, what one patient calls severe nausea, another patient may tolerate as mild nausea. So these become subjective because they're prone or open to interpretation by different individuals. And here that inter-individual variation becomes a problem. So what we could do for these kind of outcomes, so first of all, try and use objective outcomes as much as possible. Okay. Instead of nausea, can you look at number of episodes of vomiting, which is very clear, right? Either somebody is vomited once or twice or thrice. There is no doubt about that. The second thing is use standardized scales for subjective outcomes, right? So nausea can be graded as, a slight feeling of nausea, actual retching with something. So you could actually use standardized scales to make it more reliable. The third thing you need to do is use multiple observers to rate the same thing. So instead of one person rating an outcome, a subjective outcome, ask two independent observers to rate the outcome and see how much is the convergence between their assessments. If their assessments are very similar, you know that there is not much bias. If there is a lot of difference between their assessments, you know that there is a problem. Okay. All of this needs to be written in the protocol as such. What is the outcome? Who is going to measure it? How are they going to measure it? At what time point or time points are they going to measure it? Okay. And what scales or tools are going to be used to measure this outcome? For subjective outcomes, it also helps if you can blind the assessor. For example, if I am using a new technique of anesthesia, and I want to show that it is better. If you ask me to rate postoperative pain, I know that this patient received the new anesthesia, and therefore, even if he has severe pain, I will say, no, he has mild pain, right? And somebody in the control group, I will rate him as severe pain. So the best thing to do is to get an assessor who is blinded, who does not know what intervention the patient or participant received, so that there is no bias about assessing the outcome. I hope this answered your question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, ma'am. Thank
you. Can I ask for a waiver of consent if I'm using isolates from routine samples in a microbiology lab?
So often samples tend to be de-identified when they are stored. And if that is the case, you're absolutely justified in asking for a waiver of consent because it's de-identified. So who do you take consent from? Even if the sample is not de-identified and you're able to establish identity, as I already spoke to you, if there is no additional risk to the participant, then
Right.
as per ICMR guidelines, you're within your right to ask for a waiver, but it would depend on the ethics committee.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you two questions. I'll ask you one and then wait if there is someone else and then ask the next. See, currently we have been approached by a number of international institutes to join in a registry. So basically the registry involves no identifiers. It just has, so basically it is like compilation and consolidation of information across the globe. So when such a registry is submitted to the ethics, can we request a waiver of consent?
See, you could request a waiver of consent and it would probably be granted also because as I already said, this falls into the criterion of less than minimal risk. So that is fine. However, the Indian government health ministry has a rule which says if you're sharing any Indian participant data with international collaborators, then you need to go through something called the Health Ministry Screening Committee. It's called the HMSC. Okay, and approval needs to be taken from the HMSC prior to sharing of this data. So what will typically happen is the Institutional Ethics Committee will approve the study with the waiver of consent, but will ask you to obtain permission from HMSC prior to sharing of data. And
But HMSC clearance is required even if you're not getting any funding?
yes, it is even if you're not getting any funding. Any Indian data which is going abroad needs to be approved by HMSC.
Are there any other questions? Then I have one more question. So the floor is open for any one of you. The other question which I had is currently with reference to COVID-19, we have a number of stored samples. Okay, though prospectively it was not like a biorepository, you know, but we do have stored patient samples, and later on the questions come up whether, you know, it was this variant, just pull out those samples, go ahead. So at that point, we need to take ethics, right? Even if you have to send the samples for sequencing and these are stored samples. So my question to you is, if we are just taking certain PCR positive samples, of course, it is linked with the patient, his history, his contact. In the context of the disease, it is. But how rigorous should be an ethics in assessing this kind of a situation?
So, see, this would have to be written up as a proper research study and submitted as a full-fledged protocol. Now, because these samples are not de-identified, I don't know what stand the ethics committees will take. Okay, some ethics committees will say that because the samples are already with you, you could go ahead, provided you don't identify the participant's name in the final publication, which is okay. But other ethics committees may say, go back and talk to the participant or the relative if the participant is no longer alive, and say that we have your stored samples with us and we would like to do additional tests on them. So this is a slightly gray area where interpretation is different between different ethics committees. It would depend on how stringent your ethics committee is. I'm sorry, there's no better answer to that, but this is really a area open to interpretation.
Because that is something which we are really grappling with. ICMR tells us, you know, at a later date that you pull out these samples. And there's another area which does not have clarity is now in the context of breakthrough infections, ICMR has taken, you know, a blanket approval sort of from NIV. For the case record forms and the informed consent forms, and they send it to us and they ask us to recruit patients who have breakthrough infections. But under that ambit, how fair it is for us to recruit patients without taking our local ethics approval?
Absolutely not fair. And because you have your own institutional ethics committee, you will need to go through your ethics committee and get their approval prior to commencing this. So approval by NIV is not adequate. If a study is being carried out at multiple centers, each center needs to obtain its own ethics committee approval. And if the center does not have an ethics committee, they need to find an independent ethics committee which will cover them and provide approval. So using NIV approval for a study at your center when patients are going to be recruited from your center will not work.
There's one question.
Yeah. So in retrospective microbiology studies, do we need to go through ethics approval? See, every single research study has to go to the ethics committee. Okay. Now the ethics committee will decide whether they can exempt the study from ethics review at all. For example, if I'm doing a systematic review of data which is in the published domain, I'm just looking at literature from PubMed. Okay. Or if I'm looking at some other, governmental websites or other data sources and just pulling some data together, then the ethics committee doesn't take it forward. They say that your study was reviewed and exempted from further ethics review, which is fine. Sometimes the ethics committee will consider going through the study, which means the study goes through the ethics committee, and then they will tell you that either you need to take consent or it's exempted from consent. Waiver of consent is given. But you need that letter from the ethics committee, either saying that it's exempted from further review, or that it was reviewed and exempted from taking consent, or that it was reviewed and you need to take consent and here is your full approval. Any journal, any good scientific journal, before they publish your research project, will insist on having a letter from the ethics committee detailing what has the progress been. Okay, so even your retrospective microbiology studies have to go through the ethics committee with possibly a waiver of informed consent. See, even case reports, case series, nowadays journals are asking for patient consent and ethics consent. So you need to inform the ethics committee that this patient data is likely to get published.
There's only one thing which I wanted to say, that many a times for secondary data analysis, people are not, number of people are not putting it through ethics. Whereas now journals are not accepting any secondary data analysis, which is not put through your own ethics and approval is taken for the same. So this is something which I thought I must share with all of you, because we have to be very cautious about this. If there aren't any questions, I think any questions?
Yeah, ma'am, I have one more question.
Sure.
Do we need to do a clinical trial registry for all the academic projects?
Okay, so actually the clinical trial registry is meant for clinical trials, right? That's why it's called a clinical trial registry. So if you have an academic clinical trial, you definitely need to register it. What I would suggest is that even for other kinds of studies, please go ahead and register it, because, for example, our institute ethics committees insist that all studies, irrespective of whether they're clinical trials or observational studies, get registered. So for the observational studies, it's not very clear whether it's mandatory or not, but please go ahead and do it, because very often a journal might ask you if it was registered. So definitely for clinical trials, it is mandatory, even if it's an academic clinical trial. For other types of studies like observational studies, it is not mandatory, but it's preferable and you don't lose anything by it. So why not?
Thank you, ma'am.
Somebody taking only dean's permission and publishing the data, is it right? It's absolutely wrong, because the dean does not have the authority to oversee research, and it needs to be informed to the ethics committee. And as I told you, the ethics committee can decide whether to exempt it from further review or to take it through review and then give you a letter. But the dean is the administrative head of the institute, not the research head. So, what action can be taken on such publication? So now the thing is, At the journal level, most journals now insist on ethics permissions. I know there are some journals which will still accept without ethics committee permissions. So if somebody has got such an article into a journal, what you could do is probably write to the institutional ethics committee saying that such and such article has been published without ethics permission. But honestly, I don't think there's a clear answer to this, because if there are journals which are accepting it, then people are going to submit without ethics approval. So until a date comes when all journals insist on ethics approval prior to data being published, I don't think you can find a solution to this. But if you're having a problem at your level, what you could do is try writing to the ethics committee saying that X data has been published. It also depends on your ethics committee SOPs, standard operating procedures. Do they have it in their SOPs that such data should not be published? Otherwise, then they do not have any basis for taking action against such an individual. So you need to check multiple things.
I have a little different question, which is not really pertaining to the topic of today. So if you would permit, I would, for the benefit of all of the listeners and participants, see, we have a very unique situation sometimes being from the lab. We get some very rare isolates and we really want to publish that data because it's a very rare isolate and we want it out in the scientific community. And the clinician associated with the problem totally refuses. He or she says, there is no way. Can an ethics committee intervene in such a situation?
So I don't see why you need to even approach the clinician, right? The sample has reached the lab as part of routine care. The finding has been made at the level of the lab. So I don't see why you need to even inform the clinician. You need to directly write to the ethics committee saying we have X number of isolates which are unique and which deserve reporting. Please let us know whether we can go ahead without taking consent, or at the most, whether they want you to call up the patient and get verbal or telephonic consent, or at his next follow-up, the patient can give a written consent, and then you go ahead and publish. I don't see why a clinician has to be involved. And this is something we need to stress. Clinical service is different from research, right? You may have a team of doctors caring for a patient in the hospital, and that would include the, maybe the person in the medical ward, the microbiologist, the physiotherapist. Hundreds of people look after a patient. But when it comes to research, who actually contributed to the research idea or the research study? Those are the people who deserve to be included in the project or the publication. You can't involve everybody who was involved in the care of the patient, because that is something they were doing as part of service, not as part of research. So to answer your question, you do not even need to go back to the clinician. I agree that the patient was admitted under them, but once the sample has reached your lab, the sample sort of becomes your property, right? If I may use that word, and the findings are yours. So please go ahead after talking to the ethics committee.
So the answer to this is the ethics committee should intervene, because many a times it is not as part of a research, it is just as part of the service delivery that we come to, we encounter a lot of different kinds of pathogens, which we feel should be reported.
Shilpa has asked a question. If a clinician has worked hard on the workup of a patient and asked for special investigations, but that was done as part of caring for the patient, right? It was not done as part of the research project. So the clinician did think of a research idea and send these investigations to you as part of that research idea. So I agree, a courtesy may be to inform the clinician that we are planning to look at this data. But if the clinician is absolutely refusing, I don't see any reason why that should prohibit you from going ahead with publishing your findings. Madam, there are tests in which have no gold standard. So you use the best standard. For example, we know that RT-PCR for SARS-CoV-2 is not ideal, right? The sensitivity is far below what is ideal. But we will go with RT-PCR as the current gold standard until we find something better. So there is no answer to this, right? You manage with the best among the current tests and call that the gold standard. it does create a problem because the subsequent sensitivities and specificities that you're reporting are in relation to an imperfect gold standard. But because there is no other way out of this, you will have to go along with that. Which statistical test do we use? So when you're comparing two tests, two diagnostic tests, you compare their sensitivities, their specificities, their positive predictive values, their negative predictive values, and the overall accuracy of the two tests. You could also plot something called a ROC curve, that is a receiver operating characteristic curve, and compare the areas under the two ROCs to show you which test is superior. So,
I know why the question of gold standard comes up, especially in TB, because what happens is any molecular test picks up even dead bacilli. Whereas to prove active tuberculosis, you need a culture positive. And if you compare a culture with molecular, it's like comparing apples with oranges. So we are always in a spot as to how we go about with these comparisons. We need to learn more. If there are any more questions, please accept my heartfelt thanks. This was a wonderful session, and there was so much of clarity in your communication. It was very well articulated, and thank you very much. We have 2 more sessions to go. If time permits, you must share your experience with us in the next 2 sessions also, if possible. One is on authorship and predator journals, and the other one is why to publish. And since you are an editor of Indian Journal of Critical Care Medicine, if you think you have time next Saturday, please let us know.
I will definitely try to join. Thank you so much. It's been a really wonderful experience, very interactive audience. I'm so happy to be here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
On Department of Microbiology, thank you so much, Dr. Jayanti Shastri, and for wonderful talk. Dr. Priya Ranganathan, thank you so much once again. End of the session. Thank you so much, all delegates.
Thank you.